I've got a piece of 4130 3/4 inch steel tubing chucked up in my 109 Craftsman, Sears Craftsman lathe. This is going to be the tube for the pivot tube, I guess they call it, for the flap handle. This tube runs between the bushing on the firewall and the bushing that's on the seat base, and the flap handle, the tube of the flap handle, this slides inside of it, and the flap handle pivots on this. It rotates about this. The STC for the wide body cub says to take a piece of 10 inch long, 3/4 inch diameter 4130 that is 0.053, 53 thousandths wall thickness. Compared that to the tube that original that came out of the airframe, and I'm sure it's the original that was in the airplane back in 1957 when Piper made it. It measures out to be 745 in diameter, the OD, and it's chrome plated, which would keep it from rusting and seizing up inside there. Well, I set it up here on the lathe. I wound up having to cut off a little bit of it because 12 inches was just too long to be fit between the jaws of the chuck and this bullnose center that I have here. I wound up cutting it down to a little less than 11 inches, which will give me a ½ inch to cut off on either end. I can true up the ends there and cut off a ½ inch off of either end of it to make it the 10 inches that it calls for out in the specs. I've got some water-soluble solvent that I mixed up. It works okay for a lot of the cutting that I've done, but it didn't work very well in the last few times I've cut any of this 4130. The cutting fluid that worked the best on that was some high sulfur content cutting fluid, and I had some that I've had for over 50 years, or right around 50 years, that my dad had that we used when I was a kid for cutting pipe threads on steel pipe, water pipe. And I ran out of it the last time that I cut one of these pipes, and it worked really good. Well, I made a trip down to the hardware store today, found some cutting thread that they had there in the hardware store. I don't know whether it doesn't say anything about being high sulfur. But, I don't know whether it's working or not. I mean, it is cutting. As soon as I put it on there, the noise went way down on it that it was making, and it's not making too bad of a cut. Yeah, a little bit of a thread on there, so it's not a great cut. I did sharpen up a fresh bit for this, and I rounded over the tip of it a little bit so that it would make a nice smooth cut. I've got this quick change tool post holder on here, and it's a pain in the butt to use on this as far as I'm concerned, because I had to really monkey around with this to get it to go all the way over to where it would fit up against this tailstock and still be able to cut that to the end of that piece of tubing, and then still be able to get, I'm still not going to be able to get right up against the chuck on this. Oh, if I had used the old lantern style tool post holder, I probably should have put it back in there, but that's a lot easier to set up and use on this when you want to go from one end to the other. I've got a piece of 7/8 inch 4130. I took both pieces last night, put it in the sandblaster, and cleaned off all the mill scale and stuff off of it and the rust. And I'll take this piece and cut it off. It calls for a 2-inch length of this to use for bushing. This water soluble cutting fluid is actually making a better finish on there than what the thread cutting oil did, so I'm pretty sure that thread cutting oil is probably environmentally safe stuff, and it probably doesn't have any sulfur in it. Well, that was cutting pretty good, so I went ahead and shut it down. It's going kind of slow, so I went ahead and shut it down and moved it over one more pulley here, and that sped it up quite a bit. It's moving right along, and it's making a pretty nice cut. It's not a very deep cut. I wasted about half a day going to town to get that thread cutting oil. I think that stuff doesn't work as good as what the water soluble stuff that I had did. I got one pass on that thing. I got as close to the chuck as I could, which is a little closer than I'd thought, and that gives me almost 10.5 inches, so that's plenty. Take some emery cloth to it, brighten it up a little bit. That's not too bad. That'll look pretty good when it's powder coated. Alright, now I need a marker, and I'll measure that off 10 inches and cut it off. I have no way of truing up the ends of this on the lathe. If I had my G4003 Grizzly lathe going, that would fit right down through the headstock of that, and I could go ahead and trim this end off real nice and finish it, but not going to be able to do it with this lathe, so I don't have a steady rest or anything like that for it, so I'll just polish it up with a file. I did took a file and put a little bit of a chamfer on this end right here. Alright, I've got my mark made where my cutoff is going to go. I'm going to take my cutoff tool and go ahead and cut that off. Now, the largest section of this is out here unsupported, or out here on the tailstock, so I'm not going to cut all the way through this here, but this will give me a nice mark, and then I can take it over on the bench vise and cut it off there. Alright, I'm cut through in one spot there, so we'll go ahead and take this off and then finish the cut on that on the bench vise. Well, turning the ends of this and truing it up with this tube didn't work out. I didn't think it would, but it didn't work out as well as I'd hoped it would. And there's just not enough. Couldn't get it far enough back in the jaws. There's just too much stick out, and it just kept pulling it out. And then I get to looking at it, and this thing's pretty well boogered up anyway on both ends here. I'd use these tubes for driving seals and some other stuff on them, and so that end is kind of banged up. Well, I took this piece that I cut that off from and put it in on the disc sander, rolled it on there until I trued that end up, and then I'll bring it over here and I'll go ahead and I marked it off for 2 inches, and I'll go ahead and just make a mark on it here with the bit, and then I'll go ahead and cut it off with a hacksaw like I did the other piece, get it cut, and that way I'll have a good square mark with the hacksaw to get started to cut that off. That gives me a start of a chamfer. That one's cut in. I'll go ahead and take this apart and take it over to the shop and cut this off in the vise with the hacksaw, both of them, and I can true them up on the disc sander and a file, and that'll get them trued up pretty good. Now here's my pivot shaft. I brought it up here to the basement, to the workshop, and tried it out here, and it didn't just barely fit in this bushing here that's welded onto the seat frame. It wouldn't hardly spin or anything in that. This of course is the spacer that we made up, and that goes on there fine. And here's the flap handle itself, and that goes on there fine. That works on there really good, but it didn't quite fit in that bushing. Got powder coat in there, and then one end of this had a little bit of a burr or swell on it where I didn't get it machined down quite right, where I think it was up against the bullnose live center. I didn't quite get in against that to get that down. So anyway, I took it back down to the hanger, and I took a couple of thousandths off of about an inch, a little more than an inch off of each side. Measuring the thickness of this, it still measures at 63 thousandths or a little bit better, so it's probably a little less than that here now, which is still well above what the minimum requirements were on that at 53 thousandths. So this fits in there with a little bit more give now, so if I put some powder coat on this, then that should fit in there a lot better, and I can protect it. I can sandblast out. It's a little dirty on the inside of the tube. I'll sandblast down through the inside of the tube and powder coat it. And then I was almost thinking about getting some of the Caswell plating nickel coating that you can get, and I was almost thinking about doing that and nickel coating this thing, which should protect it from rust and still keep it to where it's hard and maybe spins a little better. I don't know. But anyway, I'm gonna go slip this over in the airframe and see how that fits up there.